How's it going, folks? So this week I wanted to cover this section from the American Yap where we're talking about slavery and the making of race in this chapter. And before going into this, I wanted to backtrack a little into this passage from chapter 2 that talks to us about sort of the beginnings of the slave trade in the British colonies and some of the nuances, and kind of looking at how did it evolve into the system we know of as chattel slavery. Early on, we know that the first record of slavery in the British colonies, we learn about the first slaves sold to the British colonists. They were sold by the Dutch, where they sold 20 Africans to the Virginia colonists. And so there's some interesting nuances here that we learned, is that at first, this first group of slaves that are brought are initially not meant to work as slaves for life, and this actually goes for sort of this very initial first wave of those who are brought to the colonies. Granted, they did face harsh working conditions, as I mentioned here, as well as brutal punishment and long labor terms, right, in comparison to white European indentured servants. But again, what was an interesting nuance here is that slavery at the time was not meant to be a permanent status, including for enslaved Africans. The idea was that perhaps they could purchase their own freedom at some point and eventually become free. And we do learn that there are actually some cases, right, of some who would eventually become emancipated and even own land. And so what I wanted to cover here briefly is this question of how exactly did this relationship change? So in order to understand how exactly this relationship changed, let's look at which were the groups of people that were originally enslaved in the American colonies. So who were, as I ask here, who were among the first enslaved people and servants in the Americas? Before it was just enslaved Africans, the European colonists used to enslave Native American groups. And we also have to remember that there were also European indentured servants who were brought to the colonies, and sometimes they would find themselves working alongside, in some cases, alongside enslaved Africans. Okay, and so I wanted to first, before talking a little bit about the indentured servants, wanted to talk about how exactly did they get a hold of Native American slaves. So on the one hand, some of them, they did purchase slaves from Native Americans that enslaved other Native American groups. Okay, and this was, again, these were Native Americans who were at war with others, there were already rivalries between them before the European colonists even came to the region that would become known as New England. But we do have to keep in mind that Native American slavery, right, or servitude, was different from the practice we know of today as chattel slavery, as practiced by European Americans. Okay, so unlike the European Americans, Native Americans did not practice a system of slavery where it was meant to be permanent, one that where you were essentially considered private property and where you were guaranteed essentially no rights. So I want to return to this in a bit, but that's one nuance I do want to throw out there before continuing with the lecture. Okay. Another thing to keep in mind, and what would eventually contribute to this problem. So, what also contributed to this problem or this transition towards solely relying on non-white laborers is that you also had white planters complaining about white servants, saying that, complaining that white servants were, quote, good for nothing at all. And this was due to many factors, right? So you had perhaps some who came working as indentured servants, and for whatever reason, these white planters who had these huge homesteads and land grants that were essentially stolen from Native American lands, they needed people, right, to work their lands, and so they relied on not just Native American slaves, but also white indentured servants. But they complained that for whatever reason, that the indentured servants were not as productive. And so one of the ways that these white planters got a hold of or increased their slave population was by enslaving more Native Americans, not just through purchase, but also through warfare. Okay, so this text, the text passage describes, for example, that beginning as early as the 1630s up to the 1670s, they acquired a large number of Native American slaves in the aftermath of these wars with Native American groups, such as, for example, it mentions the Pequot War, the Esopus Wars, and King Philip's War, for example. And we see in the South also, right, there's also an intensification of this reliance on Native American slavery in the South, which of course becomes over time one of the major plantation economies of the region that would eventually become the United States. So after the 1670s, from 1670 up until 1715, we see that there's a major reliance on slaves by Southern planters in Florida and South Carolina and also in the Mississippi Valley. And it's estimated that they enslaved anywhere from 24,000 to 51,000 Native Americans. A problem was that so white planters also complained about Native American slaves, but their complaint was less to do with their productivity. Their complaint was that Native Americans died too quickly, specifically that they died too quickly from disease. And granted, right, this makes sense, right, in the sense that they were not exposed to these, quote, old world diseases or these diseases that were brought from Europe. Okay, and so due to their lack of immunity, they did die faster, right, from their exposure to European diseases. But granted, right, as the text mentions, not all of these folks necessarily died simply from disease in these white planter plantations. Others also died from murder. Some also died from starvation. And another reason why Native American slavery became less desirable over time was there was also, and this is not mentioned in the text, but there were also complaints that Native American slavery was the source of unwanted warfare between the colonists and also with other Native American groups. So how do we get to this new problem where now there's a reliance on enslaved Africans? And so, as I've been insinuating here since the previous slide, this demand for slaves comes from the white planter class, right? They're demanding slaves to work their plantations and fields, and they want to go with a reliable labor source, and more specifically, they want a forced labor force. But the problem is that they're complaining that, on the one hand, European indentured servants, they view them as inefficient. They're complaining that Native Americans are dying too quickly, and so the only option left here at this point, right, is their preference towards enslaved Africans, who eventually become their most profitable labor source. And one thing I do want to point out, right, is that the Africans, right, those who were enslaved, they were no less susceptible to disease and overwork. But what the white planter class had in terms of an advantage of bringing them to the Americas is that they were brought by the tens of thousands and eventually by the millions to the Americas via the Middle Passage. Okay, so one dynamic you had in the Americas was that you had, on the one hand, Native Americans were dying en masse from disease and depopulating this region, specifically the New England region, and you also have these groups who are being pushed further west. So they're being pushed out of this area and they're dying from disease. So their numbers are decreasing. So that also means, right, that you can't rely on Native Americans as an enslaved labor force. And again, now there's also this transition to move away from European indentured servants. So again, right, this is not to say that that they simply relied on them because they saw them as more productive. This was also because they had no one else to turn to at this point. Okay, granted, right, there were other factors as well that played into this. So some did have a preference for African slaves because they came from certain parts of West Africa where they were accustomed to raising certain types of certain crops that the European planters wanted. But nevertheless, right, what's a byproduct of this, right, is what we call the forced migration, right, of enslaved Africans via this journey we refer to as the Middle Passage. And they die. Many die by the tens of thousands, if not millions, during this passage. And the reason we call this the middle passage is because this is sort of the middle part of the journey, or forced journey, or perhaps you could say nightmare, that they had to endure as they were brought to the Americas. But what was the first passage? So the first passage refers to when these folks were enslaved in Africa. And often we learn that most of the folks who were, most of the enslaved Africans who were brought from Africa, they were captured by rival African groups and nations. Again, these were folks who did not see themselves, as one people, and hence why when they went to war with each other, they of course they captured them and they sold them to Portuguese slavers. And so the Portuguese purchased these African slaves from the Africans who captured them, and and in exchange for those slaves, of course, they gave them weapons and other goods that they wanted. Okay, and this last leg of the journey, the third passage, refers to, of course, when they're brought to the Americas, when they're sold, when they're branded, and of course sent elsewhere. And so, what are some of these legal factors that eventually make Africans, or establish Africans as sort of the reliable or the permanent labor force, right, for these white planters? So one thing that we start to see is that that their status, right, as slaves, is solidified through the various laws that are passed at this time. So, for example, Virginia is the first of the U.S. colonies, or what would become the United States, of the British colonies. Virginia is among the first to pass slavery laws. So Virginia early on passes a law in 1660 declaring that enslaved Africans are slaves for life. Okay, so there's absolutely no possible way for them to become emancipated, even if they were to convert to Christianity, for example. Another law that was passed later on within that same decade is a law that declared that an enslaved woman's children, that they would also inherit their mother's status. And of course, you had other colonies other British colonies that followed Virginia's policies, that followed Virginia's model. Okay, so because I don't want to get a YouTube strike. Okay, but before I continue, I do want to cover some common misconceptions concerning chattel slavery in the Americas, because this is often among some of the misconceptions I hear from students, or some of the counter arguments I hear from students, and sometimes in the media, and I think it's important to sort of clear some of those up. So for example, there's often this claim that, quote, Native Americans and Africans, that they were, quote, enslaving their own people, so we really can't blame the European colonists. So my response to this is that, well, first of all, African and Native American groups at this time, right, they did not see themselves as, quote, one people or as one race. Okay, granted, the European enslavers saw them as one people or as one race, but these folks did not, right? These were folks who saw themselves as different nations, different tribes, different family groups, different types of kin groups, but they did not see themselves as one, quote, race, okay? Because again, race is a modern construct, and this notion of entire peoples, right, based on what continent they're from, or what geographic region they were born from. In this region, that, for example, the notion of Africa, the notion of North America, right, that's something that's very new. They didn't see themselves united in that way. So hence, right, that explains why, of course, many of these folks went to war with each other. And as I mentioned here, it's also why they didn't form alliances with each other to fight off the European enslavers. Again, they didn't see themselves as one people. Another thing I often hear, right, is there's this argument where folks will say we can't judge European American colonists for the horrors of slavery alone because Native Americans and Africans also practice slavery. Again, right, my response here is that chattel slavery in the Americas was very different from the slavery that was practiced by Native Americans and Africans. And granted, right, there's some nuances, okay, but generally speaking, in contrast to the chattel slavery practices that we see brought to the Americas, Okay, one thing to keep in mind is that generally speaking here, and I'm more familiar with how slavery was practiced in Native American societies, although I'm not as familiar with Africa. Something that I can say that that also can be generalized with slavery, and what I'm aware of with some African groups that I've studied is that on the one hand, right, that slavery is considered a temporary status. Okay, so in contrast to the chattel slavery that was practiced in the Americas, the assumption was that eventually you would become free, or that you could become free. Okay, so for example, I mentioned here adoptive because in many of these societies you had a practice where you could obtain your slavery by simply being adopted into another family, or if you married into another family, you could acquire your freedom. Okay. The last point that I have here, generally speaking, okay, is that in contrast to chattel slavery, okay, slavery as practiced by Native American groups and Africans, right, you were not considered private property. Okay, you didn't belong to someone specifically, right? And in many cases, you were allowed certain rights, or what we would refer to today as rights and privileges. You were given a sense of autonomy. You know, you didn't have somebody constantly watching over you necessarily. Okay, so these are some nuances we have to keep in mind. So what is it that made chattel slavery distinct? Okay, so as I mentioned already, under the system of chattel slavery, slaves are considered property. And what made chattel slavery in the US distinct in contrast to slavery elsewhere is that it over time became more difficult, and in many cases almost impossible, to obtain freedom. So I already mentioned, for example, in the case of the Virginia colonies, how they were passing laws making it so that slavery was considered a permanent status, and that it's a status that could be passed down from mother to child. But again, things were not like this initially, and not all the colonies had the same policy, but this sort of had a trickle-down effect where eventually you had various colonies having the same, adopting the same policies as those that were surrounding them. Another thing we see also, right, is that that evolves over time with this institution, is that slavery also goes hand in hand with these notions of white supremacist racism, or white supremacist white superiority, I guess, ideologies, I guess I could say, for the lack of a better term. Okay, and so with this, what I'm referring to here is that, as I mentioned previously, you had other folks that we would probably consider ethnic groups that used to be part of this class of people that were in servitude, right? So you previously had Native Americans, you previously also had European indentured servants, but now that they're out of the picture here, you kind of get a sense that since now only enslaved Africans are the only groups here, right, that are allowed to be enslaved, for the lack of a better term. It sort of this does over time is that it reinforces these ideas of black inferiority and white supremacy over time after many generations. So what were some of the policies that were passed over time that sort of solidified this transition to chattel slavery? So going into the early 18th century, so there's the Virginia House of Burgesses. They passed a series of laws that essentially, right, solidify this institution that we know now as chattel slavery. So as we already mentioned, there were laws, or the House of Burgesses solidified the practice of children of enslaved women, that they would be born as slaves. They also made sure to point out that conversion to Christianity would not lead to freedom, and among other policies as well. Okay, they also mandated that enslavers, that they cannot be convicted of murder for killing a slave. Among other things, they also, among other practices that they legislated, they also made it so that slave masters could not free their slaves unless they transported them out of the colony. Okay, and there's many reasons for this, but what's very clear about this practice, right, is that they didn't want emancipated former African slaves, right, or former enslaved peoples of African descent. They didn't want them to congregate or be near the enslaved African population. So essentially, right, they required those who were emancipated to move elsewhere. Okay, they didn't want them to potentially either encourage others to think that they could become potentially emancipated in the future, but most importantly, these slave masters did not want them to potentially encourage a rebellion against the slave masters. Okay. Another thing we see as well is that they would also pass laws making it impossible to convict enslavers of crime for abusing and even murdering or murdering an enslaved African. Okay, and you also have it in some cases, right, that that murder was only considered a misdemeanor for some of these folks. And again, going back to how this goes back to this to the problems of chattel slavery. Again, right, the reason why why the consequences were so low was because, according to these laws, right, since these slaves are considered property of another person, when an enslaved African was killed, right, this was interpreted as, you know, someone damaging their property, right? So it kind of dehumanizes them, and it makes them almost seem as if they were objects. Okay, and so that's you also see sort of, in a sense, how this feeds into this, I guess, the dehumanizing aspects of chattel slavery. Another thing we see here as well, one of the other things that the Virginia House of Burgesses legislates is that they declare that Black Virginians who strike a white colonist, that they may be severely whipped. Okay, so this goes for whether or not you are an enslaved or an emancipated African living in the colonies. Okay, so again, and I guess what I asked here at the end is thinking about, you know, what seems to be the intent of these laws. Okay, so you get a sense that there is this sense of, yes, there's this sense of control of trying to keep the enslaved African population, right, from potentially rebelling. But do you also see, right, that one of the long-term impacts of these laws is certainly, right, to maintain the sense of this ideology of white supremacy, right, and keeping the so-called color races, right, in their place. Okay, and so this is sort of the long-term sort of consequences of these laws. Now, what about the case of the other colonies? So we see that many of these slave codes that were passed in Virginia bleed into the other colonies. So we have here, for example, the case examples of South Carolina and Georgia. So here we learn that they also passed laws saying that defiant slaves could be beaten, that they could be branded, mutilated, that they could be castrated. They even passed a law in 1740 stating that killing a rebellious slave was not a crime. And they also made the murder of a slave a misdemeanor. Again, right, they also legislated that slave masters could not free slaves unless they transported them out of the colony. And so one thing that I do want to point out from this, right, from this slide is that, although we often hear about the horrors of slavery, one of the things we don't hear about are the uprisings, okay, that occurred in the early colonial period in the British colonies. Because we often only hear about slavery, but we don't hear about these attempts to fight back. So among some of the major rebellions, right, are the Stonewall Rebellion in 1739. As mentioned here in this placard, it says the Stonewall Rebellion of 1739. It was the largest slave insurrection in British North America that began on September 9th of 1739. This is when about 20 Africans raided a store near Wallace Creek, a branch of the Stonewall River. Taking guns and other weapons, they killed 2 shopkeepers. The rebels marched south towards promised freedom in Spanish Florida, waving flags and beating drums and shouting liberty. Okay. And so, of course, we also have these other uprisings in New York. And we also learned of another plot that was uncovered in 1741 that was unfortunately put down. And granted, right, this is not an exhaustive list. There are many more uprisings that would occur later on. One of the most important ones, I think, as someone mentioned in class, right, was Nat Turner's Rebellion. We'll talk about that one also, right, later on since that occurs much later on in the time period we're studying here. But nevertheless, right, a takeaway here is that we do have to recognize that they did rebel. Okay, they did not, as one controversial statement that was made by Kanye West, right, where he tried to make this claim or made the argument, right, that slavery was a choice, saying that folks didn't rebel. We'll get into that in the coming weeks, but yes, no, folks did rebel. People did fight back, and not always through violent resistance, which we will talk about again when we return to this topic. So, what is the lasting legacy of slavery and sort of this this attempt to construct race, right, on the backs of enslaved Africans? Okay, so as a result of the African slave trade, the Middle Passage, it's estimated that anywhere from at least 11.7 million people arrived to the Americas from approximately 1450 to 1870. But of those 11.7 million, only 9.6 million survived that journey, right? So we're talking about over 1 million people dying just in the voyage, right? The ocean voyage of the Middle Passage. Okay, and of course we would have many more that would die on these plantations, okay, due to disease and overwork, among other things as well. But one of the consequences we see also of the African slave trade, and also sort of the racial categorization that occurred during the enslaving process, whether this also includes the enslaving of Native Americans. Okay, and so one thing we start to see here develop in this time period is this construction of whiteness in opposition to blackness. Okay, and adding to that, right, you also have this sort of construction of whiteness in opposition to redness, right, or in opposition to Native American groups. Okay, so very early on, right, you start to see sort of this racial categorization and hierarchy that begins to develop in the European colonies in a way that I would say is somewhat similar to the Spanish caste system. Granted, you didn't have the exact same thing, but you do see sort of this categorization of various folks from different ethnic groups. And as I mentioned here, right, I know the text doesn't talk about this, but one thing that we also see is how other European immigrants are placed within this hierarchy of whiteness. So for example, the Anglo-Saxon English, right, or the English that see themselves as Anglo-Saxons at this time, they consider themselves white, but they don't consider other European groups who later decide to come to the colonies during the early colonial period. They don't consider them white. Okay, and in many cases they consider them on par with the Native American groups and with the enslaved African populations. So for example, if anyone wants to read more on this, I highly recommend a book by Erica Lee. She has it's called America for Americans: A History of Xenophobia in the U.S., where she talks about, right, how the Scots and Germans were essentially racialized, right, as non-white others. And it's only not until years later, especially after the American Revolution, where some of these groups would be sort of incorporated or welcomed, right, as part of the white populations of the Americas. Okay, and unfortunately, right, you have some of these groups like the Scots and the Germans, in reacting to the fact that the English were calling them non-whites or were referring to them as inferior and non-whites, in order to sort of assert their whiteness, right, or white racial superiority. They had to do so by distinguishing themselves from the enslaved black population, and in contrast to the Native Americans that they were surrounded by. So again, right, you have this sort of this cruel pattern, right, of the constructions of whiteness during this early colonial period. So the major takeaway I want us to step away from here, right, is thinking about how does colonialism impact the construction of race. In this case, in the case of the British colonies, it's impacting it influences the construction of whiteness, because we see whiteness being constructed based on these notions of slavery, and who was supposed to be considered the appropriate slave population, for the lack of a better term. And granted, right, slavery was only one piece of the puzzle, right, of how race is made. There's other factors, but here I just wanted us to focus on the subject of slavery because, again, it's one of the, I would argue, one of the most significant factors, right, that leads to the social construction of races in the British colonies. But it's not the only factor. Okay. So that's it for now, and I will see you all next week. Thank you.